Beneath the ice, something is stirring. For centuries, the Arctic was a frozen wasteland, a place ships avoided, empires ignored, and mapmakers left blank. But in the frigid dark of the Russian north, a different story was always being written. While the world looked away, one nation never stopped watching the ice. It built bases where no one thought life could survive. It sent icebreakers through waters others called impossible. It buried missiles beneath permafrost and planted flags on the ocean floor for 1,000 meters beneath the North Pole. Today, as the ice retreats and hidden treasures rise to the surface, oil, gas, rare minerals, and a shipping route that could rewrite global trade. The Arctic has become the stage for a silent, freezing confrontation. Nuclear-powered icebreakers cut through waters once locked in permanent winter. Military runways appear on islands most maps don't even name. Submarines vanish beneath the polar ice cap, and no one can say for certain where they surface next. This is not a new ambition. It is the culmination of a 100-year obsession. To understand why Russia wants the Arctic, we must go back to the moment an empire first looked north and decided that whoever commands the ice commands the future. The Arctic did not begin as a battlefield. For most of human history, it was simply the edge of the map, a boundary beyond which explorers perished and empires lost interest. But Russia's relationship with the North was different from the very beginning, shaped not by ambition alone, but by geography itself. Unlike Britain, France, or the Netherlands, whose empires stretched across warm oceans and tropical colonies, the Russian state was born landlocked in cold, continental terrain, hemmed in by rivals to the west and vast, empty frontiers to the north and east. The Arctic Ocean was, for centuries, Russia's only truly free coastline, one that no other great power directly contested, because no other power believed there was anything worth contesting. That belief began to change in the 17th century, when Russian fur trappers and Cossack explorers pushed east across Siberia, tracing river systems that emptied into the Arctic Ocean. Settlements sprang up along the coast, Arkhangelsk chief among them, not as symbols of imperial glory, but as practical footholds for a state hungry for furs, and later, for a warm water port that never quite existed. Russia's tsars, from Peter the Great onward, obsessed over access to open seas. The Baltic and Black Seas were won through bloody wars against Sweden and the Ottoman Empire, but the Arctic required no war at all. It simply required endurance. Ships could reach it, and no rival empire seemed to care enough to stop them. By the 19th century, this quiet advantage began to take on strategic weight. Russian naval planners started to recognize what the Arctic actually offered: a coastline stretching thousands of kilometers, largely undefended by any rival, connecting Europe to the Pacific by a route that, if navigable, would cut weeks off any journey around Africa or through contested straits. The problem was ice. For most of the year, the Arctic route was frozen solid, choking any dream of a viable trade corridor. Still, expeditions pressed forward. Russian, and later Soviet, cartographers and scientists began mapping the coastline with an intensity unmatched by any other nation, driven by both scientific curiosity and an unspoken understanding that whoever controlled the map would eventually control the region. The true transformation came after the Bolshevik Revolution. The Soviet Union inherited the czarist dream of Arctic mastery, but approached the problem with an entirely new set of tools: state planning, forced labor, and ideological conviction that nature itself could be subdued through industrial will. Stalin's regime launched an aggressive campaign to conquer the Northern Sea route, the maritime corridor running along Russia's Arctic coastline from the Barents Sea to the Bering Strait. In 1932, The icebreaker Alexander Sibiryakov became the first vessel to traverse the entire route in a single navigational season, a propaganda triumph broadcast across the Soviet Union as proof that the northern frontier could be tamed. Behind this triumph lay immense human cost. Arctic settlements, mining operations, and infrastructure projects were built substantially through the Gulag system, with prisoners forced to labor in brutal cold to extract nickel, coal, and other resources from the frozen ground. Cities like Norilsk rose from this suffering, built above the Arctic Circle in conditions that killed thousands of the very people who constructed them. The Soviet state did not view the Arctic as a place to be preserved. It viewed it as a resource to be extracted at whatever human cost that extraction demanded. Military interest deepened as the Cold War began. The Arctic Ocean offered the Soviet Union something no other body of water could: a hidden avenue for nuclear deterrence. Ballistic missile submarines could slip beneath the polar ice cap, sheltered from satellite detection, and surface at a moment's notice within striking range of North America. The Soviet Northern Fleet, based on the Kola Peninsula near Murmansk, became one of the most heavily fortified military concentrations on Earth. Submarine pins were carved into mountainsides. Radar stations dotted the coastline. Entire closed cities, invisible on official maps, existed solely to support this submarine force. For Soviet military planners, the Arctic was not a frontier of commerce. It was a sanctuary of last resort, the one place where a nuclear response could hide from an American first strike. This militarization intensified through decades of Cold War tension. American and Soviet submarines conducted a silent, largely unseen contest beneath the ice, tracking one another in a game where a single miscalculation could trigger catastrophe. Reconnaissance flights probed Arctic airspace. Both superpowers built listening stations designed to detect any breach of the other's underwater sanctuary. Yet even as this shadow war unfolded, the civilian Arctic project continued. Soviet engineers pursued the dream of a year-round Northern Sea route with singular focus, eventually producing something no other nation possessed: a fleet of nuclear-powered icebreakers, capable of crushing through ice that would stop any conventional vessel. The Arctica, launched in 1975, became the first surface ship to reach the North Pole, a feat achieved through nuclear propulsion that gave Soviet icebreakers virtually unlimited range and power. Then, almost overnight, the empire that had built this apparatus collapsed. The disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991 devastated Russia's Arctic infrastructure. Military garrisons were abandoned. Icebreakers sat idle for lack of funding. Scientific stations closed. The closed cities of the Kola Peninsula, once symbols of Soviet might, became emblems of post-Soviet decay, their populations shrinking as the state that sustained them crumbled. For nearly 2 decades, the Russian Arctic existed in a kind of suspended animation, strategically vital in theory, but practically neglected, its bases decaying and its ambitions dormant. The turning point arrived not through military planning, but through climate change. As global temperatures rose through the early 21st century, Arctic sea ice began retreating at a pace that stunned even climate scientists. Satellite records showed summer ice extent shrinking year after year, opening waters that had been permanently frozen for all of recorded history. What had once been an impassable frontier began to look, for the first time, like a genuine shipping corridor, one that could, within decades, rival the Suez Canal for certain Asia-Europe trade routes. Beneath that retreating ice lay something else entirely: enormous reserves of oil, natural gas, and rare earth minerals. Some estimates suggesting the Arctic holds roughly 13% of the world's undiscovered oil and nearly a third of its undiscovered natural gas. Russia, more than any other Arctic nation, held the geographic advantage to exploit this transformation. Its Arctic coastline dwarfs that of Canada, Norway, the United States, and Denmark combined. Under Vladimir Putin, the dormant ambitions of the Soviet era reawakened with new purpose. The Russian state began pouring resources into reconstructing its Arctic military presence, reopening Soviet-era airbases, and constructing new ones on islands so remote that most Russians themselves had never heard of them. Franz Josef Land, a scattered archipelago deep in the Arctic Ocean, became home to a new military installation nicknamed the Arctic Trefoil, a heated, self-sufficient base capable of housing troops for months without resupply. Novaya Zemlya, once the primary Soviet nuclear testing ground, saw renewed military activity. Runways were extended. Radar systems were modernized. A new generation of Arctic-specific Army brigades trained specifically for combat in extreme cold. Simultaneously, Russia pursued its claims through international law, submitting extensive geological surveys to the United Nations Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, arguing that the underwater Lomonosov Ridge, a mountain range stretching beneath the Arctic Ocean toward the North Pole itself, was a natural extension of Siberia's continental shelf. If accepted, this claim would grant Russia sovereign rights over a vast portion of the Arctic seabed, including the pole itself. In 2007, in a moment that captured global headlines, a Russian expedition used a submersible to plant a titanium Russian flag on the ocean floor beneath the North Pole, a largely symbolic act that nonetheless signaled unmistakable intent. Canada and Denmark, whose own continental shelf claims overlap with Russia's, dismissed the gesture, but the underlying competition it represented was entirely genuine. Economic development followed the same trajectory as military buildup. The Yamal Peninsula, once a remote expanse of tundra inhabited primarily by indigenous Nenets reindeer herders, became the site of one of the largest liquefied natural gas projects on Earth, exporting fuel to Europe and Asia through ports that would have been frozen shut a generation earlier. The Northern Sea Route itself began carrying real, measurable cargo tonnage, a fraction of global shipping but growing every year, aided by Russia's expanding fleet of nuclear icebreakers, now numbering more than any other country possesses, including vessels capable of breaking through ice nearly 3 meters thick. This resurgence did not go unnoticed. NATO members, watching Russian Arctic militarization with increasing alarm, began reassessing their own posture in the region. Norway expanded its northern military presence. The United States, whose Arctic coastline in Alaska had been comparatively neglected for decades, began investing in new icebreakers of its own, acutely aware that its aging fleet could not match Russia's capability. Perhaps most significantly, the accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine transformed the Arctic strategic map overnight. Suddenly, 7 of the 8 Arctic Council nations were NATO members, leaving Russia as the sole outlier in a region it had once dominated militarily without serious challenge. China, though possessing no Arctic coastline of its own, inserted itself into this contest by declaring itself a near-Arctic state and pursuing what it termed a polar Silk Road, investing in Russian energy projects and Arctic shipping infrastructure in exchange for access and influence. This partnership, born partly of necessity as Western sanctions isolated Russia's economy following the invasion of Ukraine, deepened Chinese involvement in a region once considered the exclusive domain of the Arctic states themselves, adding yet another layer of complexity to an already tense strategic environment. The consequences of this renewed contest extend far beyond military posturing. Indigenous communities across the Russian Arctic, including the Nenets, Chukchi, and other peoples who have inhabited these lands for millennia, find their traditional territories increasingly reshaped by industrial development, pipeline construction, and military expansion, often with limited consultation or benefit flowing back to the communities themselves. Environmental scientists warn that accelerated development in a warming Arctic creates a dangerous feedback loop in which industrial activity contributes to further warming, which in turn opens more territory to industrial activity. The very ice loss that made Russian Arctic ambitions newly feasible is itself driven by the global carbon emissions that industrial expansion, including Arctic oil and gas extraction, continues to produce. Strategically, the Arctic today occupies a position not unlike the one it held during the depths of the Cold War, but transformed by new stakes and new participants. Submarines still patrol beneath the ice, though now tracked by satellite systems and underwater sensor networks far more sophisticated than anything available in the 20th century. Military exercises in the region have grown larger and more frequent, conducted by both Russian forces and the NATO alliance that now surrounds Russia's Arctic flank on nearly every side. The Northern Sea Route, once a distant dream of Soviet planners, has become a genuine, if still limited, artery of global trade, its future importance likely to grow as ice continues retreating and shipping companies seek alternatives to congested southern routes vulnerable to disruption. Why then does Russia want the Arctic? The answer is not singular but layered, built from centuries of accumulated history. It is geographic, rooted in a coastline longer than any rivals, granting natural advantage in a region newly valuable. It is economic, driven by resource wealth that promises revenue for a state whose economy remains heavily dependent on energy exports. It is military, continuing a Cold War logic in which the Arctic's ice serves as sanctuary and its strategic position offers proximity to rival powers. And it is, perhaps above all, symbolic, a continuation of a centuries-old narrative in which Russia sees itself as a nation defined partly by its mastery of extreme environments that other powers considered uninhabitable, untamable, and irrelevant. The ice that once made the Arctic a forgotten frontier is now disappearing, and with it, the illusion that the region will remain peripheral to global affairs. What was once a blank space on a map has become one of the 21st century's most closely watched strategic theaters, shaped by 100 years of ambition that began with fur trappers along frozen rivers, hardened through Gulag labor camps and submarine sanctuaries, and now culminates in a contest whose outcome may help determine the balance of global power for decades to come. The flag planted beneath the North Pole in 2007 was titanium meant to endure. Whether Russia's claim to the Arctic proves as durable remains one of the defining geopolitical questions of our time.